her with us as well. Recently baptized as of Monday night. So we're very happy that she obeyed the gospel and is here with us to worship. We led off last time. We were about 7 verses into Exodus chapter 7. That's where we're going to pick up tonight. But before we do that, we need to go to God in prayer. Any prayer requests that we need to mention, I haven't been following emails or anything right now, so y'all help me out with that. The Brads. Yeah. Okay. Alyssa mentioned the Brad's daughter, Ruby. The Brads are friends of several different folks you may know, and friends of Jeremy and Alyssa as well. And their daughter is 2, is that right? 2 years old, and has found out that she has, I believe they've decided neuroblastoma. We're still waiting some of the tests, but she began chemo this afternoon. So remember that family in your prayers. So Ms. Barber said she talked to Diane, no blockages, and she just needs to continue recuperating from the procedure. So keep her in mind as well in your prayers, and that is very good news. Sister Barbara's back with us. She's been struggling with some issues with her leg, I believe, and so good to see her back out among the living. And she brought a friend, so that's good too. Anybody else that we need to mention? I know besides the little sniffles and odds and ends, summer colds, everybody seems to be struggling with. And Lisa is coming home tomorrow from Salt Lake City in Utah. Her treatment went well, and she should be back with us. So prayers for her safe travels. How long has it been since the last trip? Had it been 6 weeks already? Okay, I was thinking it was pretty quick turnaround on this one. So continue to remember her as she has to go finding that care all over the country instead of being able to do it right here locally because of some kind of silly reasons, seems like. But continue to remember her. Unless there's anybody else that we need to mention. Bobby, would you mind to lead us in a prayer? We've got one more. Hold on. Okay. Barbara's sister, not doing real well at all, so remember her as well. Go ahead.
We ask for you to recharge our batteries, Lord. Fellowship in the face of the rest of this week. Come back again. We ask for you to class here today.
Amen. Thank you, Bobby. All right, like I said, we'll begin in Exodus chapter 7. We got to about verse 7. And we're going to move pretty rapidly through several chapters because instead of reading all of this, since Exodus tends to repeat itself quite a bit, we typically see, and it's kind of a pattern through here in the way that Moses wrote this book, we see God tell Moses what to do, and then Moses tell Pharaoh what he's going to do, and then Moses actually do it, or Moses and Aaron actually do it, or God actually do it. And so we kind of see things in triplicate as we go through here. But of course, from this point to about chapter 11, through chapter 11 or so, we're going to be talking about the plagues. And of course, the death of the firstborn moves even beyond that. And Exodus chapter 12, talking about the Passover. So hopefully we'll get to the Passover this evening. That may be a bit ambitious, but we're going to try our best. So here we go. But we left off in Exodus chapter 7. We heard that Moses is 80 years old and Aaron is 83. And you remember there's been a lot of back and forth about whether Moses is qualified, and God has continuously told him, tell my people, I am the Lord, and I'm doing this thing. He's continued to reaffirm that promise in a very powerful way. So keep that in mind as we go through here. Keep also in mind the idea that we're looking for types, things that are symbolic or a foreshadowing of Christ in the future. And then also for these ideas of faith versus fear driving people's decision making. But the first plague that we run into, beginning in verse 14 of chapter 7, is the water to blood. Moses puts his rod to the river Nile, the water turns to blood. Now he meets Pharaoh out there when Pharaoh comes out in the morning to the river. He meets him there and he tells him what's going to happen, and it happens. He does it. And the water in the river turns to blood. What else turns to blood? All the water, right? Not just the Nile, but the water in everything. If you had water in a pot on your counter, it turned to blood. Every bit of blood in Egypt, every bit of water in Egypt turned to blood. So there was no drinkable, potable water in Egypt at that point. How many days did it stay that way? A week. Full 7 days, it says. A full 7 days. The magicians, Pharaoh's magicians, did the same thing, right? They were able to also turn water to blood. I'm a bit confused by where they found the water, since all the water had been turned to blood, but apparently they found some water somewhere. They maybe had to dig it up out of a well. They found water and they said, oh, look, we can do this too. Let's keep a track of that the magicians try to keep up for a little while, and they managed to for a very short period of time. Do you think they actually had any kind of mystical powers, or were they just tricksters and charlatans who put on a good sleight of hand? Right, so they obviously didn't have God's power. Do you think they had any kind of small power at all? Right, the Egyptian magicians. No, they were just tricksters, right? They had worked themselves into this position by being able to give Pharaoh a good show, by being able to put on these tricks and these performances, these displays. Yes? Right.
God made a, I don't know if he could allow them to do it, or one of those things that we'll never know.
It is a good question. I don't have an exact answer for you. The quick switch, right? They just turned rod to a serpent. Now they turn water to blood. This is something that a magician today could do. He could make that water in that bucket be blood in the bucket next. He obviously swapped it. We just didn't see how. And so I agree with Jeremy. These things are explainable sleights of hand. And I don't think we need to give them any more credence than that. But, of course, I agree with you, Kathy. One of those things we'll put on the list to ask God. Either way, they don't keep up for long, and you'll see that as we go through this. Each of these plagues had a very specific purpose. They weren't just 10 horrible things God thought up. They weren't on his bucket list of things to do to Egypt. And they weren't just the first things that popped into his head. God had a purpose and a reason for choosing these particular plagues, and possibly even for the order that they're in, but that's probably beyond the depth of what I want to try to explain to anyone, because I don't understand it myself. But, for instance, this first plague, when he turned water to blood, specifically the water in the Nile, who did this offend? Think about, we talked about all the gods of Egypt, the little g gods. Who would this offend? What kind of? The god of water, right? It's the god of the Nile. Hapi is the god of the Nile for the Egyptians. And he was a water-bearing god. He brought the water that provided life and everything that they needed, sustenance. So Hapi, the god of the Nile, or the god of the water, is the one that's really tied to this plague, as saying, you know what, I'm more powerful than that God. And we're going to see this 10 times in a row. God's going to basically say to Pharaoh and to the Egyptian people, I'm more powerful than that God. Well, he's knocking them off the list. Here's the first one, Hapi, god of the water, or god of the Nile. And 7 full days, and we've talked about the importance, the meaning of that 7, that number 7, in the Hebrew culture and how it becomes even more significant as time goes on for the Israelites. Any questions or comments about the first plague? And we see here, like we will see for 9 more plagues, Pharaoh does what? What's that? He reneges, right? He says, go tell your God to make this stop, and I promise I'll let you go. And then his heart is hardened, and he doesn't do it. And so we see this over and over and over, this cycle. So the second plague, which begins in the first verse of chapter 8, the frogs. God has instructed Moses and Aaron, bring up frogs out of the Nile and out of the waters. And the frogs are going to fill the houses, the beds. They're going to be everywhere. They're going to be hanging in your closet with your clothes. I mean, they're just going to be everywhere. Frogs everywhere. The Egyptian god Heket, or Heket, I don't know how you say the name, but was a goddess of fertility or renewal. And this particular goddess was typically depicted with the head of a frog. The idea of renewal, cleanliness, purity, and with the head of a frog. And so now God has put all of these frogs into everyone's homes and all over the land, taking, the exact opposite of what you would think about cleanliness and renewal and those kind of things. So all of these frogs come into the land of Egypt. Question: are these plagues also happening in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites live? They are, right? It says, over all the face of the land of Egypt. It's talking about the whole thing. Even the Israelites are dealing with these plagues. So they get to dig wells for water, and they're also dealing with frogs in every conceivable place, and probably some inconceivable places. Sir? Right, so we'll see when Israel becomes exempt, right? When God says, I will put a division between you and my people. And that's why I brought that up now, so that we can see when kind of that switch is turned off. Why do you think God allowed or had some of these plagues apply to Israel as well?
At the very beginning of it, anybody can walk in and say, I'm messenger of God, and we're going to do this. And whether it happens or not, the Israelites weren't necessarily, trusting people who laid it out for them and showed the face of it. They had to believe. They had to be forced to let that barrier go so that they knew. Moses and Aaron actually represented God on their back to Pharaoh. Otherwise, they would have never fallen.
Yeah, like I said, when we got into chapter 7 last week, I said I have in my Bible there, it says the real deal, and it points there. Because we see that Moses has gone to the people on God's behalf and said, this is what we're going to do. And the people, because of their misery and because of their groanings or their hard work, said, no, we don't believe it. We're not getting behind this. Yes, sir.
The Israelites have been in Egypt a long time. They would have a long time to adopt this is so they need to break some Massachusetts. Not just solely in Moses, but everything.
Jeremy makes the point that the Israelites, because of their long dwelling in Egypt, may have also tended toward the idea that some of these little g gods were the real deal. And so God was, in some sense, possibly needing to correct their thinking on that as well, get them back on the right track. Any other comments about that second plague? Yes, sir.
Moses told Pharaoh, I'm going to let you ask. Tell me when you want the Lord to take these frogs away. And Pharaoh said, tomorrow.
Why do you think that is, Brother Dennis?
I don't know. But sometimes people don't want to get said like that.
I think it's a very good tie, a very good point. It may be a stubbornness that we've seen in Pharaoh exhibited time and again. He's not quite ready to admit that they can't handle the frogs. Just like I think sometimes we're not quite ready to admit we really need God's full help getting rid of sin or handling those things in our life. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am. Right. Possibly so. The only indication we get is it says 7 full days. So we don't know if that's still going on when the frogs hit or what exactly is happening. Right. Yeah, I don't know. We don't get any indication. I don't know if the Nile, the waters of the Nile came from the head of the Nile and had to wash all this blood out, or if it was like a switch was flipped and God turned it back. We don't get an indication here as to exactly how that plague was cleared up. But we do here see that the frogs are sent back to the river. They're put back in the Nile tomorrow, as Brother Dennis pointed out. Thank you for pointing that out. The next plague, starting in 16, some versions call them lice, some versions call them gnats, depending on where you look. Tiny bugs, either way. And where did they come from? The dust, that's right. They came from the dust. So they were created from the dust. Out they came and covered up the entire land of Egypt. Up until this point, it is good to point out, the magicians could also create the frogs. They also pulled that off, which we've all seen a bunny come out of a hat. Not a big deal. But the magicians did cause the frogs to come up onto the land. They couldn't get rid of the frogs, though. They could bring frogs, but they couldn't make frogs go away. And so we're starting to see the magicians crack up just a little bit. Well, here with the lice, they said, we can't do that. We don't know how that's done, and we can't. They can see the fact that this is the real God. Look at verse 19 of chapter 8. Verse 19 of Exodus chapter 8. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Another interesting thing to note about this particular plague and several others is there doesn't seem to be any warning to Pharaoh about this one. We go straight into the gnats right out of the frogs being gotten rid of. Whereas many of the plagues, God says, go tell Pharaoh, here's what you're going to do, and then do it. In this case, God says, Moses, stretch out your hand, and we're going to make these lice come across the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh finds out about it when he gets full of lice or gnats. I don't know that it really matters to make that distinction, but I just saw that distinction with several of the plagues, thought I'd point that out. Lice, or gnats, being made out of dust was a huge offense to the Egyptian god Geb, or Jeb, G-E-B, who was the god of the earth. Would have been the god over all the dust, the dirt, any of those kind of things. And so now all of a sudden, the real God has made a pestilence out of what this very God was supposed to be able to control. And so that's the third plague and the way that it affected the Egyptian gods. Any comments about that or questions before we move on?
Real famous verse, one that most of us know. And it seems evil for you to serve the Lord for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell, but it is in my house and the Lord. So there were Israelites that were serving
The Egyptian gods, right. That's a good confirmation of the point that was made. I hadn't thought to go to that verse. That's a good point. The fourth plague, flies. These flies came up and covered the entire land. The Egyptian god Khepri was the god of creation or rebirth. This god was typically portrayed with the head of a fly. And I don't really understand the connection in the Egyptians' mind. They took the fly that crawls around on the garbage and the dead stuff, and they put its head on this god that was rebirth and creation. I don't get that. Maybe because flies can multiply really quickly, is what they were thinking. I don't know. That's fair. Regardless, I don't think how to pick the head of a fly for my God of rebirth and creation, but more power to them. Their aesthetic choice. But you can see here, now we've got flies covering the entire land of Egypt. And so this depiction or this symbol of their very God of creation and rebirth is now causing all kinds of havoc and nastiness, if you will, across the land. Look here at this part. This is where the Israelites are no longer included. This is where this division happens. Look at verse 23 of chapter 8. 23 of chapter 8. Actually, we'll read 22 as well. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen. And the Lord did so. There came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses. Throughout all the land of Egypt, the land was ruined by the swarms of flies. You see this idea of ruin and waste being laid to the land by these creatures that are the very symbol of creation and rebirth to the Egyptians. And from this point on, the Israelites aren't going to be included in any of these plagues. They're now off the map. That part of the land is not going to be affected. Of course, until we get to the final plague, when we see the death of the firstborn and them being warned about the way to prevent that. So, any comments, questions about plague 4? I know we're just kind of rolling down the list, but that's where we're at right now. So we see now the 5th plague, the death of the livestock, the murrain of cattle, as I learned it as a child. And the Egyptian god or goddess, Hathor, the goddess of love and protection, was typically symbolized as having the head of a cow or livestock. Now the Egyptians, what did they think about cows? Kind of a weird duality, right? Cows were sacred in one sense, but cows were also to be abhorred in another sense. They got this goddess with the head of a cow, and yet at the same time, they don't want cows anywhere close to them. They have no desire to be herdsmen or people that take care of cattle, which is one of the reasons why the Israelite nation has become so large in the land of Goshen. They basically took a job that the Egyptians found undesirable and really capitalized on that. So kind of a weird contradiction with the Egyptian people. But was this just death of the cattle? What all died? Just cows? All livestock, that's right. So that's everything. That's horses, that's mules, donkeys of the Egyptians. So what you've got to look at is this is not just the death of some cows in a field. This is the total annihilation of industry in the land of Egypt. Their mode of transportation, things that they eat, things that provide clothing, animals that provide work in the fields. This is everything to the Egyptians. Now we're getting into the big deal, stuff that is really, really going to put a crippling hurt on the land of Egypt and is going to show this total devastation of the land. Any comments or thoughts about death of the livestock? Yes, sir. Yeah, Egypt had become a powerhouse because of God in two ways. Like you said, the initial, ascension of Egypt into being a world power during the times of famine because of Joseph And then also because they have the Israelite people as an enslaved group of people or as servants who are tending these cattle, who are tending this very fertile area of Egypt, who are making the bricks for all of the construction and bringing a huge amount of money and prestige into Egypt, both through construction and through livestock and through trade. And so Egypt is built up largely on the backs of the Israelite people. And we know that the Israelites actually outnumbered the Egyptians. And so Jeremy's exactly right. God is now really just knocking the legs out from under Egypt that he's given them. He has made Egypt prosperous. Why do you think he made Egypt prosperous back in the time of Joseph? It was all for this moment right here. You see, God knew, as God does, that at some point the people of Israel were going to come out of the land of Egypt and they were going to bring all the livestock that they had tended. They were going to bring all the wealth and the riches and the jewelry and the clothing that the Egyptian people had amassed. They were going to take every bit of it and they were going to leave. And all because Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. You see the pride and the arrogance that this one guy had that caused the whole nation to basically be destroyed. And I think you're exactly right. And I think, and of course, we don't know God's mind, but I have no reason to doubt that God would have continued to bless Egypt if they had been a blessing to Israel. If they had allowed Israel to go the first time, I have no doubt that God would have continued to bless Egypt. We don't know that for sure, of course. It didn't happen, but there would have been no reason for him not to allow Egypt to continue because of their help to the nation of Israel. But unfortunately, it didn't go that way. It went the exact opposite. So, any other comments? Yes, sir. That's right. Even in God's punishment for the wickedness and the arrogance and the stubbornness of Pharaoh, he offered a warning. He told them, put your stuff up. Put your livestock in their pens, in their barns, in their houses, so that this doesn't happen. And unfortunately, these people didn't listen. And so we see that happen to the livestock. And again, in verse 4, chapter 9, the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt. So remember that. All right, the sixth plague. The boils or the sores. How did the boils or the sores come about? What's the mechanism here that God uses through Moses and Aaron? Ashes, that's right. So Moses, Aaron take these handfuls of soot from the kiln, these ashes that have been burned, and they throw them into the air, and it settles basically and gives all of the people of Egypt these sores, these lesions. And you hear about the magicians, right? Apparently they've still been in the game up to this point. They've been trying. They've at least stood before Pharaoh and given an attempt. Now they can't even come before Pharaoh because the lesions, the boils are so bad on them. They can't get out of the bed, can't come stand up and even try to pull this off. But again, we see the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. He did not listen to them as the Lord had spoken to Moses. The god Isis, the Egyptian god of medicine and peace, the one that should have been able to prevent this, to keep this from happening, well, God has now dealt a huge blow to that god.
But then, when we get to the last plague, he's still not
Right. So what plagues affected Moses and his house and what didn't? I agree, you're right. It doesn't specifically say that Pharaoh was affected by the boils, but it does tell us that the frogs came into his house, the flies came upon him and his servants, and the lice as well, right? All those things are mentioned. So this would be the first one, I think, that didn't affect Pharaoh, if that is the case. It's definitely not mentioned here specifically that it affected him. What's that? Janice thinks it did.
Well, I'm not saying it. I'm not saying that it's just a theory of mine, but it's off my head.
Because it's not specifically mentioned here. Right.
You can't control the frogs, you can't control where the water goes for the most part. You can't control, while the Egyptians couldn't control any of the plagues, but boils are more specific.
You're saying maybe because of Pharaoh's status, he was not exposed to this, possibly. I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. I think either way, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. I mean, he's seen some horrible, horrible things befall his entire nation, seen his magicians not be able to do anything about it, and he still continues to refuse. It's a good point. It does say all men and beasts, and he was a man. Right. Yeah. I don't know. We're probably playing at semantics at this point. But so again, Pharaoh refuses to let the people go. And so without any comments, we'll move on. Yes, ma'am. Right. That's a good point. That is, I mean, the rest were unfortunate, and death of the cattle was definitely a big financial blow. But now all of a sudden you're getting very personal. You know, these things have now become a physical ailment or sickness. I'm with you. If I had boils, I'd be saying, you can do whatever you want. Please get far away from here. Let me go sit in my ash heap and scrape like Job did. But yeah, that's a horrible, horrible thing to have to deal with, I'm sure. So the seventh plague, we see the hail come down, the hail rain down. And that's beginning in, I'll have it marked here somewhere, verse 13 of chapter 9. We see that the hail comes down. And Brother Golden, I think we got a little ahead of ourselves with the murrain of cattle, the death of the livestock. There's no mention there, I don't believe, of having a warning to put your livestock in shelter. It happens here. It's this plague of hail. He says, put your livestock in shelter, else if they're out in the field, they're going to be killed. And so that's what we see there. Say again? Well, it does say that the livestock are dead, right? So what do we do about that? How do we reconcile that? If now we're warning to put the livestock up, but we thought the livestock were all dead. Right. And I think that's a good inference to make, is that the people of Israel have shared their cattle, their livestock, hopefully for a high price. But I think you're exactly right. That's probably what we're seeing here, because it's very clear in chapter 9, first part of chapter 9, that all of the Egyptians' livestock died, but none of the Israelites did. It says that just straight up. So I think that's a good inference to make. You had a comment?
I often wonder, you know, I took the number of Egyptians who listened to this with a small number, because I imagine they were similarly minded to Pharaoh. But I often wonder, the ones who did listen,
Verse 20 of chapter 9, then whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into his houses. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. I'm sure we're definitely starting to see a bit of a mass conversion among Egyptians. Maybe not a huge number, but it's definitely got to be at least a notable number of Egyptians who are finally kind of getting the hint. I don't know about you, if I've seen all of the water turn to blood, frogs everywhere, lice come out of the dirt, flies cover the land, all the cattle have died, I've had boils on me, and now somebody's telling me that hail's coming down, I'm probably going to listen, right? It's time to start paying attention and listening to that. So hopefully a good portion of them did. I don't know. Here's where it gets a little interesting. Well, for Nut, N-U-T, just like it sounds, the goddess of the sky. That would be the Egyptian god that would have been the one that was on the chopping block here with the hail coming down, great bouts of thunder and lightning coming down as well. And we know that this continued for quite some time. Very heavy hail such as had never been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. Now, what all did this hail destroy? The big thing it got that hasn't been gotten so far was the crops. All of the grains and other things that were bountiful and plenty in the land of Egypt are now being destroyed. And it names off the flax and the barley. The barley was in the ear and the flax was in bud, which means basically it hit them at the worst possible time when they could not stand anything to come along and damage them. Yes, ma'am. The slaves or servants that were in the field, that's right, the ones who hadn't listened, who were caught outside, were also killed, and any livestock that was caught outside as well, definitely. But you see here, even in this, God's mercy to the people of Egypt. I just read that the barley and the flax were destroyed, but look what verse 32 of chapter 9 says. The wheat and the emmer, which is a type of wheat, were not struck down, for they are late in coming up. So even in God destroying all of this in the face of Pharaoh, he leaves the wheat and this other type of grain to come up. It's going to come up in a later season, and there will be some sort of sustenance for the people of Egypt who remain after this great devastating event takes place. You can't ask more of God than that. I mean, that is such a display of his heart, his love for people, in that he would even have the grace to have that. Oh, no, you're exactly right. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. Y'all let me head way too far down that path before you pointed it out. Yeah, got you. You're exactly right. We'll see how that goes in a minute. So we've gotten to this point now where the hail has come down and destroyed the barley, the flax, these people and livestock caught outside. And now we see Pharaoh begin to start trying to bargain with God a little bit. He here admits that he has sinned, he's sorry, and he's going to let the people go. Of course, there are conditions to this. What does he say that he'll allow now at this point? We're not going to get to chapter 12 either. What did he say that he would allow here in the later part of chapter 9? It's actually in the first part of chapter 10 what we're looking for. Chapter 10, verse 3 through 11 in that area there. Look in verse 7, 8, 9, that area. I can't get you any closer than that. That's right, just the men. He said, leave your women and your little ones here, because if all of you go, then I don't know what you'll do to me. So we're gonna keep the women and the kids, and the men can go out and worship. And when y'all get done, you can come back. You're gonna have to come back because we've got your families We're holding on to them. And you see here Pharaoh starting to try to put these conditions on God. And we talked about this a while ago. What did God initially ask through Moses and Aaron of Pharaoh? The very first time he asked, what did he ask for? That's right. Just 3 days to the wilderness to worship. That's it. And then we see how Pharaoh responded. And so God very clearly in chapter 6 and 7 said, I'm done with that. You are going to let my people go. You're going to send them out. You're going to beg them to leave, and they're going to take everything you have when they go. And so God's past this point of negotiating. It's not something he's going to do. You hear the phrase, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Well, God's not going to negotiate with this little guy Pharaoh who thinks he's a god. That's not the way this is going to work. And so then we see the 8th plague. God basically says, no, I don't think that's a very good idea, but let me tell you what is a good idea. I'm going to send locusts all over the land. And by the way, they're going to eat the wheat and the other grain because it's come now. And so thank you for pointing that out. The Egyptian god Seth was the god of chaos, or the god of storm and anything kind of crazy, anything that was out of the ordinary. The idea of these storms that come through, that roll through and are very destructive. This god now is the one that we'd say was on the list, because this God should have been able to control the fact that God made the locusts come out of the very. They came out of the sky like a storm, like a cloud. And so the locusts come through and they eat everything that's left to the ground, nothing left. I read this backwards at first. I saw when God sent the west wind, I was like, oh, he blew them over in the desert, and that's why it's a desert. They just ate everything. But the west wind coming out of the west, of course, blows these locusts into the Red Sea, where they are destroyed after Pharaoh has once again said, wait a minute, I'm going to do it now. I'm going to let them go. Does Pharaoh let them go? No. Once again, we see Pharaoh have a change of heart. And again, these are all just Egyptian plagues. These things only affect the Egyptian people as we go down through this list. So that's number 8. What is number 9? Darkness. All right, so 3 days of full darkness come upon the Egyptians. And here's where it really starts hitting them hard, hitting them where they live, because Ra, the god of the sun, is the primo Egyptian god. He is only below Pharaoh himself. And it seems a little backwards because they think Pharaoh is the physical incarnation of the son of Ra, but anyway, that's their logic. So Ra, the god of the sun, now can't even keep the lights on. God turns to complete darkness the land of Egypt for 3 days. Now this is not just dark. This is not the sun went down, it didn't come up. This is dark. This is no light. Can't see your neighbor, can't see your hand in front of your face, can't see anything kind of dark. I don't know about you. Have you ever been in that kind of dark? Pretty rare, right? We don't hardly ever end up in that kind of situation. In a cave, that's right. You go in several of the different cave tours and they'll cut the lights off and say, well, this is complete darkness. Of course, unless somebody's cell phone lights up. But you're right, we rarely experience the kind of darkness they were talking about here. And so this was a true blow to the Egyptians after they had just dealt with all of these other things. Yes?
I wonder, does that extend to their own sources of life? Do they like fire? It couldn't complete as no darkness.
It says they did not see one another, nor did any rise from his place for 3 days. But the people of Israel had light where they lived. So the idea there is, yes, that not even a candle lit or a fire, a flame, a lamp, nothing worked. It was complete and total darkness with no remediation of it for 3 whole days. I don't like the sound of that at all. Pharaoh didn't either. He comes again bargaining with God. And what does he say? What does he agree to at this point? He says, I'll let you go worship, but leave the flocks, leave the livestock. That's right. Leave all your stuff, leave all your animals. You can go, you can take the wife and the kids, but you cannot have the livestock. And Moses shuts that down pretty quickly because, of course, they need livestock to be able to sacrifice to God. It's an essential part of what they do. So that's a no-go as well in chapter 10, verse 24 through 27. And then, of course, the 10th plague we'll talk about more in detail. Larry will pick that up Sunday. The death of the firstborn, where we finally affect the Egyptian god, Pharaoh, who thinks he's the most powerful, the son of Ra, the god of the sun, and now even his own son is going to die. And then, of course, this is the establishment of the Passover and also the establishment of the Hebrew calendar that we'll see in chapter 12 as well. So exciting stuff coming forward. Thanks for your attention, your comments. Sorry for the nature with which we churned through that, but thanks for helping us try to catch up. And we'll see you next time.
Good evening. If you'd like to mark the song invitation, it'll be 968. Good evening. If you'd like to mark the song of invitation, it'll be 968. 968. 968. Once you have that mark, turn to 859. 859. 859. We'll sing the first and third verses on this song. 859. If you got it, let's sing. What a song of delight in a city so bright. We'll be back to heaven's fair dawn. How the ransom will raise happy songs in his praise when all of God's singers get home. When all of God's singers get home, whenever the sorrow will come, there'll be no place like heaven, my home. When all of God's singers get home, having overcome sin, hallelujah, amen, will be heard in that land o'er the foam. Every roar will be light, and his voice will be bright, when all of God's singers get home. When all of God's singers get home, whenever the sorrow will come, there'll be no place like heaven, my home, when all of God's singers get home.
It is great to hear all the talk going on that we have to settle everybody down to start the worship period. But over the past couple of sermons that I've preached, I have brought in the topic of choice, of choosing. I want to do it one more time tonight. Primarily, we're going to be talking about spiritual life and spiritual death, but I want to start out with a little story about physical life and death. In the early months of 1865, there was a man standing on a train platform in Jersey City, New Jersey, waiting for a train. He happened to see a fella stumble and fall off the platform, and when he reached and grabbed him and pulled him back up, he saved him from injury and possibly death. Now here's where we get to some irony in the story. The man that was saved from serious injury or death was Robert Lincoln. The man who reached down and grabbed him and pulled him back to safety was Edwin Booth. If those last two names sort of trigger a little insight, just a few weeks later, Edwin Booth's younger brother would assassinate the father of the man that he had just saved. John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Edwin Booth, the brother, saved the son. I like to study history. I like to look at the odd things of history. But now let us change and look at spiritual life and death. This past Sunday, I spoke about the three special trees. And in that, we discussed Adam and Eve, how they had made a choice between the tree of knowledge of good and evil that they chose, which led to spiritual death, and the tree of life that would have led to spiritual life. All through the Bible, God gives man a choice. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 30, says, "See, I have set before thee this day life and good, and death and evil. In that I command thee this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that thou mayest live and multiply. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in the land whither thou goest to possess it. But if thine heart turn away, so that thou wilt not hear, but shall be drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I denounce you this day, that you shall surely perish, and that ye shall not prolong your days upon the land. Whether thou passest over Jordan, go to possess it. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live, that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and that thou mayest obey his voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto him, for he is thy life, and the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which the Lord swore unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them." They could choose to love and obey his commandments, verse 16, or they could choose to serve other gods, verse 19, where he set before them life, death, blessing, and cursing. Today, we have those same options spelled out in the New Testament. All of us in here that got the word was extremely pleased and happy Monday night when Lindley decided it was time to put Christ on in baptism. But you know what's more important than us on this earth thinking that a blessing? If you go to Luke chapter 15 and verse 10, Christ says, and I want to read it to make sure I get every word of it just right. Luke 15 and verse 10. Christ is speaking and says, "Likewise I say unto you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth." We often say here when we close out a lesson that it's the Lord's invitation. And truly it is, because that verse in Luke said that in heaven there was rejoicing when one sinner would repent. And the requirements are very simple. You just have to hear the word of God. Then you have to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. After you do that, you need to make up your mind that you will repent, change your ways, change your lifestyle, obey God's commandments. You then confess his name, and then you are baptized, as Mark 16:16 says, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned or condemned, depending on your version. And then if you are a Christian and have slipped and made a mistake, in James we're told that we confess our faults one to another, pray one for another to be healed. If any of you at this time need to come forward, the Lord's invitation is here.
Oh, they tell me of a home far beyond the skies. Oh, they tell me of a home far away. Oh, they tell me of a home where the storm clouds rise. Oh, they tell me of an unclouded day. Oh, the land of cloudless day. Yes, this brightness through the unclouded day. Oh, the land of cloudless day. Oh, the land of an unclouded sky. Oh, they tell me now, where no storm clouds rise. Oh, they tell me of an unclouded day. Oh, they tell me that He smiles on His children there, and His smile drives their sorrows away. And they tell me that no tears ever come again. And that lovely land of unclouded day. Oh, the land of cloudless day. Oh, the land of an unclouded sky. Oh, they tell me of a home where no storm clouds rise. Oh, they tell me of an unclouded day.
See each of you here this night, as probably was mentioned in class out here, and Larry made allusion to it as well. I guess third time will be a charm. This past Monday evening, Lindley Sellers obeyed the gospel. She's sitting back at Kathy Mong's seat back there, so I'm sure that you'll want to speak to her and let her know that we appreciate her decision and glad that she's part of the body of Christ. A number of people that we need to still keep in our prayers. First of all, Kevin's father, as he's decided not to take any more treatments as far as for his cancer. So let's keep Kevin and his family in our prayers. Sister Diane had her procedure this morning, and things went well. Didn't find any major problems, so she's back at home resting. Andrea also had a procedure today, and she's at home as well. So we need to keep them. As far as Lisa in our prayers also. When is she traveling back? Tomorrow? Okay. So keep Lisa Wright in our prayers also. She'll be traveling back home tomorrow. As hopefully you're aware, this coming Saturday will be our outreach to the community. I don't know if this is meant that I'm supposed to read it very quickly or won't take long to get it through. It's in parentheses, says will not take long. So tomorrow they'll be having a final work day to get things ready. So at 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, if you're able to come to the building and try to get things done and last things wrapped up for Saturday. Also, you may have seen the email that if you're planning on being here to help Saturday, please let Jason know that as well, so that make sure that everything is taken care of and enough people to handle all the things that will be going on. So 9 o'clock Saturday morning. Oh, be here at that time, right? Okay. So be here at 8:30. Make sure you've got the times down and everything's ready. All these oranges are rolling away. Kids don't know how to hold on to them. One there, one there, one there. So if you're not careful, you'll have orange juice. All right. Alex and Jackson swap. So Alex has a closing prayer. Yes, sir.
Remind you again about Brittany Bragg. She started chemo treatment today.
Okay.
Even for her last home,
She's 2 years old. Is that
almost.
almost 3? Well, that means 2.
But they say the treatment's going for 12 to 15 months, and the numbers right now are about 2 to 5 years.
All right. they very serious as far as the cancer that she has. So yes.
I don't know if it's been out there or not, but the Sims family, their 2-year-old.
Right.
Was in a full accident, very similar to Williams.
Right.
And he, brain dead, they're taking him off the bus.
This is
I'm sorry, I'm completely out of case here.
right. The Swim family, he is a graduate of the Memphis School of Preaching, and they also had a 2-year-old that fell into the swimming pool. Was unconscious when they went to the hospital, carried to Vanderbilt, and unfortunately, they have decided not to do anything, and so we need to keep that family in our prayers also. So hate it when little ones go through these things. Let's keep that family in our prayers as well. Alex, if you would, we'll be standing, please. We'll be dismissed in prayer.
Please bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this lovely day. Thank you for this wonderful day you've given us to come and worship you. Please be with those who are sick and allow them to get better. Be with those who are traveling and allow them to get to their destination safe and sound. Be with all those who are mentioned here tonight and allow them to get through their various things. In Jesus' name, amen.